My name is Dr. Aaron Benanav. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin, and next autumn I'm going to be moving to Syracuse University in New York, where I'm going to take up a position as a professor in the sociology department. And I'm also going to be a core faculty member in the Autonomous Systems Policy Institute there. The book I wrote, Automation, the Future of Work, is a book about automation. It's a book about what jobs are going to look like in the future, but it's very different from other books on that topic, because unlike those books which often paint a picture of a coming dystopian future where no one has any jobs, or possible utopia where no one has to work, my book gives a more empirical and grounded account of what's actually happening with technologies today. And I show with empirical evidence and statistics that the story we're being told about automation in the media, by governments and so on, is not really that accurate. I show that there is a real problem around job security today. Many people are finding themselves without access to the kind of work that they need to feel secure in their lives. But that problem is due, I say, not so much to an acceleration of technological change and the advent of a new age of workless workplaces, but rather it's due to a general slowdown in the rate of economic growth. In other words, the problem isn't really that jobs are being destroyed at a faster pace than they were in the past. It's that jobs are not being created as fast as they were before. And so from this very different empirical perspective, I consider a range of other questions about politics, about the possibility of a universal basic income, about what the future of jobs are going to look like and whether they're going to be more secure or insecure. And I also look at ways that we could get to a much better world, a world of what I call post-scarcity, even if automation turns out to be more of a dream than a fast-approaching reality. Universal basic income is a fascinating proposal for how to change our relationship to work in our society and how to help those who are in need, who are too poor to be able to afford the goods and services that they need to live. Now, I'm a critic of universal basic income, but whenever I talk about it, I talk about the positives of it first, why so many people are excited about this idea, because I think it is an exciting idea and it's really worthy of our attention. What I find so inspiring about the idea of universal basic income is really the idea of this universal provision that raises everybody out of poverty. The universal part of it is really important too. I live in a country, the United States, where most welfare programs are means tested. And you might think that that's about ensuring that people really are in need when they ask for welfare benefits. But in reality, in the United States, the means testing, the what people have to prove in order to get their benefits, has been extremely punitive. It's been designed to make it very hard for people to access their benefits. And what researchers have found is that many people who would benefit, who really qualify and need this assistance, find it very hard to navigate the bureaucracies required to actually gain access to what they need. And so the idea of this universal provision is that people have it regardless, no questions asked. And some people would say, well, then the rich are going to get this benefit too. And in a way, yeah, sure, you could tax it back from them if you wanted. But I think that the universality of it is actually an important principle because it sort of says everybody deserves this, whether they're rich or poor. And it kind of takes it away from a kind of economic question and makes it a political question about what we deserve, what we all deserve as human beings. And I think that in itself is a really important idea. Now, some people have been critical of universal basic income, and I have been too, because to my mind, it's really important to see that there have been proposals for universal basic income coming from across the political spectrum. And of course, that includes people on the far right. In the United States, people like Charles Murray, who's one of the most infamous racists in America, he's a big supporter of UBI. And then you have a range of different economic and political thinkers and political parties that have shown interest in this idea, all the way to far left groups. And so it's had this really wide range. The difference to me between the right-wing programs and the left-wing programs is that on the right, universal basic income is usually seen as a replacement for the existing welfare state, whereas for those on the left, they see it as an additional welfare program. And so by necessity, the left-wing programs are going to be more expensive. In order to get to their goal, they're going to have to expand welfare provision. One of my general points is that we live in a time of slowing economic growth, and that actually makes it really hard to imagine a very highly beneficial universal basic income ever coming around. We've lived through 50 years of slowing growth and unrelenting austerity and deficits and cuts. And in that time, I think what we've seen is that it's been very hard to advance a project of increasing welfare benefits. So given the fact that the automation theorists, in my view, are wrong, it's going to be very hard to get a universal basic income that does what it's sort of most emancipation or freedom oriented, those who really wanted to end poverty for good, it's unlikely to look like what they want. It's much more likely to kind of emerge at a low level and then remain at that low level and not really be able to rise to the challenge of what the proponents want from it. There's an additional problem with universal basic income that I think we should really talk about, which is that universal basic income proposes to meet people's needs by giving them money. And it's sort of saying that, whatever problems people face, by giving them money, they should be able to go out and solve those problems themselves. And I think that that is a really inadequate perspective. And one way to think about why it's inadequate is by analogy with climate change. So in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, a lot of people said we could solve climate change with a carbon pricing system. By pricing carbon, we could fix the problem. The idea there was that there was just a problem. The market system is generally working very well. The only problem was that carbon didn't have a price. And so if we created a market for it, then it would solve all of our problems. Today, more and more people think there isn't really a market solution to this. We need big public investments in order to change our energy mix. It's not something that the market's going to solve itself. We're going to need to have huge investments undertaken at the public level, maybe in partnership with private firms, to radically transform the infrastructure of our society, to change the way we use energy, also to build houses or transform housing for people so that it's more energy efficient, to change the way we do transportation. And all of those things require big, coordinated investment plans. And the same is true. The same kinds of problems apply to UBI. The idea of UBI is that the market system is basically working well, and the only problem that we face is that there's these poor people who don't have enough money to buy the things they need. And so if we give them money, it kind of completes the market in a similar way to how carbon pricing was supposed to complete a market. In reality, giving people money isn't enough. We need, again, massive, especially facing climate change, we need these massive, coordinated public investments to build the services that people can access in order to have a better life. So that's going to require big investments in education, healthcare, housing, energy provision, and so on. And once you think about that, once you think about the investment side of the problem, not just the income side, you see that there's a lot more that we have to do and can do in order to solve the big problems that we're going to face in the future, which include not only how to solve poverty, but solving poverty in the context of the dramatic changes that we need to undertake to prevent global warming. Korea has been a really fascinating and impressive development story from the perspective of the whole world. In the early 1950s, Korea was mostly an agricultural country. And over the course of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it became one of the fastest growing countries in the world. It achieved a rapid industrialization of the workforce and of production. And then starting in the 1980s, in the late 1980s, Korea started to undergo a process of deindustrialization that was very similar to other cases of deindustrialization that were unfolding across Europe and North America. So for anyone interested in the history and future of work, changes in the kinds of jobs that people have, and roboticization and automation, Korea has just been a very interesting case. And like many other researchers in the field, I've also really looked into Korea's experience with these trends to learn about what's going on there and also what is going on in other parts of the world. Now, one might think that because Korea is so much at the forefront of information technology development, they would also be at the forefront of automation destroying jobs. According to the International Federation of Robotics, Korea has one of the highest ratios of robots per manufacturing worker of any country in the world. It's right there at the top place, essentially. So one might expect that because Korea has so many robots in industry, that Korea would also have fewer workers in industry, in manufacturing, than other countries in the world. But that's not true. And the fact that it's not true is one of the reasons we should begin to doubt some of the story that the automation theorists are telling us. So you might think that the countries that have the highest number of robots also have seen the most deindustrialization, but that's not the case. Countries like the United States, which actually have fewer robots per worker than many of the heavily industrialized countries in Europe and East Asia, countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, they're the countries that have seen the most deindustrialization. Countries like Japan and South Korea and Sweden, which actually have many more robots per worker, also have a much higher share of their workforces still employed in industry. So it can't be the case that job destruction in manufacturing is simply the result of adding robots. What's really going on there is that having those robots in manufacturing actually protects jobs in countries like Korea, Japan, and Sweden, because those companies, those manufacturing companies or industrial companies, they're competing internationally in this really hyper-competitive international markets where there's all of these places that have workers who earn much lower wages. And given that heightened competition, it's precisely by bringing in robots that countries like Korea or firms in Korea, as well as in other countries I mentioned like Japan and Sweden, it's by bringing in robots that those companies have been able to preserve jobs in manufacturing. So that's just one little piece of data, but it should help us think more broadly about what's really going on when we think about the relationship between adding robots and removing people from their jobs. That relationship is never quite so simple. Now, that doesn't mean that adding robots and computers and digitalizing work isn't having massive effects on the ways that work is being done. So one really dramatic change we're witnessing in many countries is the expansion of platform labor and different kinds of mini and micro jobs being accessed through these platforms as some of the only jobs that people can find. And that's contributed very broadly to a process of making workers more insecure, more precarious, making it harder for them to make ends meet, and subjecting them to the rule of algorithms instead of human managers. And I'll say more about that a little bit later in the interview. It's definitely true that these platforms are making workers more precarious, but what researchers have found is that the precarity or the insecurity of workers on the platforms is part of a broader phenomenon of insecurity in the wider labor market. It's because other kinds of jobs aren't emerging or being created that workers are insecure throughout large parts of the economy. And the platform economy is really feeding off of that general insecurity. So what we really need to do is we need to understand why are workers so insecure? Why are workers not able to find jobs that give them a decent living? And there we need to look at a longer term story. And this is one of the reasons why I cast a little bit of doubt on the automation story. It's not that automation isn't happening. Automation is happening all the time. And when we look at all the technologies we have today, like smartphones and the internet and social media, we can see how much these are changing our lives in general and our work. But what we see when we look at a longer term perspective is actually that technological change, at least in the workplace, which is measured typically by a statistic of labor productivity, that these measures of the pace of change, we actually see that change is slowing down, not speeding up. And as part of a broader phenomenon, countries around the world are seeing their economies just grow more and more slowly. This has affected Korea a lot less than countries like, France or the United States or the United Kingdom, but it's affecting Korea as well. And so the result of this process, which economists call secular stagnation, it's the tendency of economies to stagnate, that's what's causing there to be not enough jobs. And that's a huge problem, because when we think about a capitalist economy, like the economies we've had now for quite some time, those economies really depend on rapid growth to generate jobs and create job security. And as these economies are kind of maturing and as international competition becomes much more severe, it's been harder for these economies to grow quickly. And as a result, workers are finding themselves more and more in positions of insecurity. And so this insecurity is very real, and technological change is very real. But what I'm saying is that we need to think in a more complex way about the relationship between people's job insecurity and technological change. And the missing factor here is this tendency towards stagnation. Instead of a world in which robots are producing more and more stuff and economies are growing faster and faster and can provide more and more due to roboticization, what we're seeing is that robots are being added when and where they are. Actually, changes in technology in the workplace is happening more slowly than in the past. But the real story, again, is that stagnation tendency. It's the fact that these economies are growing more slowly. And that has big consequences for all kinds of questions concerning politics, the future of work, and what we should try to imagine when we think about the possibilities for a much better future. Taylorism is a really important concept for thinking about both the past, present, and future of work. The term Taylorism comes from Frederick Taylor, who was an important figure in the history of what was called scientific management. It was the study of, the detailed study of work, of particular forms of work, to see exactly how workers did the work, how much time it took them to complete different tasks. And it was used by managers to kind of both speed up and intensify the work that workers were doing, and to kind of take knowledge that only workers had about what work required and give it over to managers. So a very famous example of this was applied in Henry Ford's car factories, where these kind of scientific management principles were brought in to study exactly how the different aspects of car production worked, and to kind of take that knowledge and put it on the side of managers so they could know roughly how long it should take for workers to complete the various tasks associated with making a car. Today, people speak about a new trend, which they call digital Taylorism. And it's kind of a contradictory concept. On the one hand, it's really true that in the platform economy, we have now algorithms taking on the role of managers. And to some extent, you can see this as a kind of acceleration of Taylorism, because these algorithms on people's smartphones, it enables these companies to track workers' activity down to the most minute detail that no human observer would have been able to achieve in an earlier period. And the same is true at Amazon warehouses, where workers wear little devices or carry around devices that track their every movement through the warehouse and kind of compare it to the optimal amount of time that their movement should take. So you have this kind of acceleration of Taylorism, sort of observing and counting and calculating all of a worker's motions and activities to better understand the work and to make it possible to extract the maximum amount of profit from that work. On the other hand, what's a little contradictory about it to call it Taylorism is that historically Taylorism was all about empowering middle managers, that is, the layers of management that interacted with and kind of watched over workers and told them when they were working too slow or handled their pay and these kind of questions. Whereas today, the whole point of algorithmic management is to try to replace a lot of those managers with computers and with algorithms. So, for example, a taxi company has to have a lot of managers to manage all of the different drivers who work for the company. Uber just has an algorithm that does a lot of that work automatically without any human intervention. And that's something that people sometimes like about those jobs, at least initially, is that platform jobs, you can work on your own pace. You don't have to deal with a kind of manager breathing down your neck, watching everything you do. You don't have to deal with scheduling issues. At least in America, it's a big problem that workers are often told at the last minute that they have to come in on their day off. Companies are often purposefully understaffed. Understaffing is a way of ensuring that everyone's working at a very high intensity all the time. So compared to dealing with human managers, algorithmic managers can at first seem to offer a really high degree of freedom. But what people find over time is that because the algorithms collect so much data from them and have such insidious ways of influencing and kind of coercing in the end different kinds of behavior from them, that there's something almost maybe more disturbing in the long run about this form of algorithmic management. When people talk about the technologies of the future, they often focus on technologies like digital surveillance tools, all of these ways that workers are now being managed by algorithms and machines. And so when they think about the future of work, it looks really dark. And I think there's a lot of reasons to worry about that. I mean, a lot of our future does seem to be that our managers are going to know every keystroke we make on our computers, especially if we work at home. And they're going to know exactly where you are if you're a delivery service driver and how you're making routes and what that compares to the kind of what they think the best route is. But I think that there's also a lot in contemporary technologies that could actually make workers' lives better and make work more satisfying. It's just that a lot of these technologies aren't really going to be implemented without a struggle. So I'll give you an example. There's a nursing collective in the Netherlands that handles home health care. So they go into neighborhoods and they work with older people who can't take care of themselves and who need some assistance. And this company, it's all worker run. So all the collectives of nurses are actually run by the nurses themselves. They go into a neighborhood and they start to work with people there. And while they're working, they might encounter a disease or a kind of difficulty with a patient or a client that they hadn't experienced before. And this company has an intranet. It has an internal internet that it uses so nurses can communicate with each other. And they can say, hey, I'm encountering this patient who has a disease I've never studied. Does anyone know about this or has worked with people with these diseases before and can help? And so instead of using technologies to kind of watch over workers from above to surveil them, here we have an example of using technology to allow workers to connect with each other and learn from each other rather than trying to take the knowledge from them and putting it on the side of management. This is an example where workers are actually sharing knowledge with each other and they're able to kind of grow together. I think a lot of the time, what we should be thinking about when we think about digital futures of work is thinking about the ways these technologies, not only can they take decisions out of people's hands, which can be useful sometimes, But a lot of other times what they really enable us to do is to make decisions together in a new way. And it's that kind of communicative part of the technology, which actually would really empower workers and connect them to one another, that I see as essential to any positive vision of the future for work. So post-scarcity is a concept that you see in some science fiction. That's where it's most common. It's discussed a little bit in the context of automation theories as well. The basic idea post-scarcity is to imagine a world in which scarcity has been abolished. And what that usually means to people is a world where technologies allow us to produce kind of a limitless quantity of goods and services. We have access, therefore, to everything that we need without having to work. And so everyone just experiences this kind of incredible security in their lives. And there's a lot of research about how much of our brains are kind of constantly engaged in thinking about the question of survival. We just spend so much of our time worrying about what's going to happen to us and what's going to happen to our children and how we're going to be able to make our rent or pay for food or keep our jobs or, put our kids in a good school so they don't have to worry. And all of these kind of concerns, when people live in a post-scarcity society, those things melt away and human beings are able to kind of think in this totally new way, like they're more interested in or have time for a range of other concerns that have nothing to do with survival. And those could be things to do with, with their passions that they have. It could just be about enjoyment. It could be about all kinds of projects that they would do if they didn't have to worry about survival. That's what I'm really interested in. That's a post-scarcity society. But I take kind of a unique perspective on it because I'm trying to show that there's an alternate way to think about scarcity and post-scarcity that's not so technological. Like most accounts of post-scarcity focus on this idea that with these brilliant new technologies like a replicator, that's going to be the way that humanity gets beyond work and beyond meaning. But there's another way to think about scarcity, which isn't about, overcoming scarcity by achieving limitless production, but rather about getting to a point where we can meet everyone's needs with the resources we do have. So post-scarcity then isn't about the kind of technological cornucopia or absolute abundance of goods and services. It's about a world that ensures that everybody's needs are met. And of course, what those needs are is an open question. It's a political question, it's a cultural question, but it's about getting to a world where we ensure that we use the resources and the technologies we have first to ensure that everyone's okay. And we kind of guarantee that everyone will be okay, that no one is going to have to worry about their survival. And that means in a world that can't automate everything, that means reorganizing work, changing how work is done and how it's distributed. And I think that this social act, and I'm saying that there's a whole number of social thinkers running from the original utopian Thomas More to thinkers like Karl Marx and Peter Kropotkin and W.E.B. Du Bois and John Dewey and Otto Neurath. There's all of these thinkers who were working on the social question of post-scarcity alongside the kind of technological vision that you were seeing emerge in 20th century science fiction. So this social idea that we should reorganize our work and reorganize society to ensure that everyone's needs are met and so no one has to worry anymore. The way that once we did that, it would change the distribution of power in society. It would change, the kinds of work we do have to do to be okay. It would force us to renegotiate what that work looks like. And the most important thing is that it would give people this real freedom to face their lives, not thinking about what they're going to do to survive. They're going to be thinking about what they're going to do with the time of their lives and, how they're going to make good on that and how to divide their time between enjoying themselves and contributing something to humanity and making a meaningful life. And, I think that is a realistic future. I think the future post-scarcity as just a purely technological overcoming of our condition, that's a fantasy. but the idea of the social overcoming to get to a world where we really do meet everyone's needs, that is a realistic future that we can fight for. And to me, it is the next stage in our human cultural evolution to get there, to kind of put our concerns about survival aside. We have the technologies to do that, and to really free people to become the best kind of people that they can be. I don't see why we would set our sights on anything else.